So at any rate, besides Occam's razor as a really creative insight that came out of what was otherwise a very mundane period in philosophy where they just rehashed old problems that they had done in the Greeks, was the ontological argument. And the ontological argument Aquinas' arguments, when we look at them, are what are called a posteriori. In other words, the argument from first cause basically depends, first of all, on taking observations from nature that there are cause and effect relationships in nature. So you got to go from nature. And the design argument basically is an argument from analogy that says, well look, we make some things, and we make things that serve particular purposes, and what we make to serve a particular purpose needs a designer to design it to fulfill that function or purpose, whether it be a light bulb, a projector, a pen, a pencil, an iPad. And so if something like the eye fulfills a particular function or purpose, shouldn't we think that the eye has a designer as well, and who would that designer be but God? But those types of arguments, the design argument, the cosmological argument, depend on first taking observations from nature. Now, the interesting thing about the ontological argument is it's a priori. Remember, we saw this in connection with the argument that Parmenides gave, right? Where he argued something from concepts alone. Didn't depend on observations from nature. And so Anselm's argument is from what is called pure reason, just like Parmenides' argument against change. Not based on sense. A priori means prior to and independent of sense experience or of experience. Ontos is the Greek word for being. Ontology, which is a sub-branch of metaphysics that studies what Aristotle called being qua being. In other words, existence in and of itself. What is it? Are there one or many existing things? And we saw that the pre-Socratics were pretty much preoccupied with those issues. But what's interested philosophers since he posed it is that here we have an argument from God's existence that goes from pure thought. So can we prove God's existence just like we would a mathematical theorem? You know, that's what it raises. Now, I always call this a shower argument or a driving down the freeway argument. Say, what do you mean by that? Don't worry if this doesn't quite hit you. This is one of those things where, you know, you hear it and you say, you know, I don't quite see how the moves in this argument. And then you're up, you know, in your ladder and up in the morning and you think about it. And all of a sudden, you know, you have this eureka moment. You say, oh, yeah. be perceived has to exist in reality, or it wouldn't be that than which no greater can be thought. These arguments basically, the way I used to run from an abstract concept of God or ontos of God's being. Well, how do we describe God as an existing being? From a concept of God to a conclusion that what fits the concept namely, in this case, God actually exists in reality. So that's the striking thing about this argument. From mere thought alone, we're generating a proof about something that actually exists in the real world. And, now, of course, not everybody thinks that you can do this. And you do want to separate out, these are two different things. Because we're going to see one of his strongest critics, and your book calls his name Guanilo, and most people call it Guanilo. So, but at any rate, one of his strongest critics was a fellow monk. And so you need to separate out this issue about whether or not you think God exists from the issue of whether or not you think a particular argument that some philosopher claims proves that God exists really does the job. Because there are two different things. Guanilo, fellow monk to Anselm, and as well Thomas Aquinas didn't like the ontological argument either. Were presumably just as devout as St Anselm was, but they just didn't think this argument did the job. Now, there are a couple of biblical verses, and I put them in here, in the Psalms, that say, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." So when St. Anselm talks about the fool, he's not trying to bully somebody, he's not trying to be, a name caller, but he actually has a biblical verse in mind. And so what he's trying to do is take somebody who denies God's existence from premises that he nonetheless thinks they'll accept, even though they deny God's existence, to a conclusion that he thinks is going to necessarily follow. And so, this is the purpose of the argument then, to kind of meet the denier of God's existence halfway, and then show them, well, if you agree to this, guess what? You're going to have to agree that God actually exists. So how does he get there? Well, first of all, the concept that he uses is the concept of God, and here we're talking about the God of monotheism, right? Zeus isn't going to work here. Thor isn't going to work here. We're talking about God with the traditional attributes of God. And this is even clearer in Descartes' version of the argument, which we'll get next time. But God is a being than which none greater can be thought. In other words, the greatest being we can think of or imagine. Right? It seems reasonable. Now, remember, Anselm in basically a Catholic country where, I mean, the average person, even if they don't think God exists, just from their cultural upbringing, is going to pretty much agree on the traditional Judeo-Christian concept of God. Now, obviously, in a very pluralistic society, like ours is getting to be more and more, maybe you're not going to be able to assume that even somebody who denies God's existence is going to be working with the same concept of God. But it was much more plausible for him to think this in a country where the background, beliefs were the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church. So he says, even the fool who denies God's existence would basically agree with him on the concept of God, that God is the greatest being we can imagine or think of. Or as he puts it, that than which no greater can be thought. So he says, the fool is going to at least agree with me on that. But now where does he go from here? Well, he says, but can we, if we're going to agree that God, if God is there, is the greatest being we can think of or imagine, that than which none greater can be thought, the question that Anselm raises is, can you really deny the existence of a being if you conceive of him that way? And of course his answer is no. We can't even deny. In other words, he's going to try to show us that we would end up in a contradiction, a logical contradiction, trying to deny God's existence if we think of God as that in which no greater can be thought. So in other words, this proves then the existence of God with the mathematical certainty of a demonstration. So he says, well, where's the fool coming from in this thing? The person who denies God's existence. Well, he says basically what they're saying is that they agree that God as that than which no greater can be thought, none greater can be thought, exists as a concept in the mind. As Father Guido Sarducci once said, what is God? Well, God's a concept. That God exists as a concept in the mind, but God doesn't exist in reality. And here again, he thinks that he and the non-believer can agree on the concept of God. And this is actually his own illustration, but I put it in the PowerPoint. He says, well, it's one thing to exist just as a concept in the understanding. It's another thing entirely to exist in reality. And so the fool says, so it's another, one thing for a painting to exist just in the mind of the painter as a concept, another for it to actually exist in the real world and reality, right? And he says this is the kind of thing we're discussing. Now, here, if you recall what we were going over last time about Plato's views, you get a buried assumption about Platonic metaphysics, namely that it's somehow greater to actually exist than to exist just as a concept, that somehow existence makes something greater. So it's greater to exist in reality than only in the mind. So if that in which none greater can be thought existed only in the mind, then it wouldn't really be that in which no greater can be thought. In order to qualify as that, it would have to exist in reality as well. So you see where he's going here? He's saying, wait a second, it's greater to exist in reality than just as a concept in the mind, but you, the fool, are saying God is that than which none greater can be thought, only exists as a concept in the mind, but not in reality. But wait a second, if something existed only as a concept in the mind, it wouldn't qualify as that than which none greater can be thought, because we could always think of a greater, namely something that existed in reality as well. So do you see where he's going on this? All the non-believer has to do is buy the concept of God as that than which none greater can be thought, and this Platonic assumption, and you say, well, if you buy the description of God as the greatest being we can think of, then in order to qualify as the greatest being we can think of, God has to exist in reality and not just as a concept in the mind. So it would be a contradiction then, you know. So this is what I said. So in order to qualify as that in which none greater can be thought, it has to exist in reality. So then God has to exist in reality and not just as a concept in the mind. What was this? So he says, in other words, it would be a contradiction to hold on the one hand that God is the greatest being we can think of, and at the other hand, hold that God only exists as a concept in the mind and not in reality, because something that exists as a concept in the mind is not that in which none greater can be thought. In order to qualify as that, whatever fits that concept has to exist in reality as well. So you can't, on the one hand, agree that God is that in which none greater can be thought, and on the other hand, deny that God exists in reality, because if God really is that in which none greater can be thought, God has to exist in reality as well, and not just as a concept of the mind. So you're involved in a contradiction by denying God's existence. Tracy, you're saying God is the greatest being we can think of, but God exists only as a concept in the mind. Well, if he exists only as a concept in the mind, then he's not the greatest being we can think of. So you're holding both that God is and is not the greatest being we can think of is one way of describing the contradiction. So the fool has to admit then, in other words, has no choice, right? If he buys the premise, the fool must admit that what is in his or her mind, the concept of God as the greatest being we can think of, has to exist in reality as well to qualify as that. So if the fool merely buys, the denier of God's existence, buys into the concept of God as the greatest being we can think of, Anselm says, you're going to have to admit that that being exists in reality as well, and not just as a concept in the mind. Therefore, QED, God, as God is traditionally conceived, must exist. Now, Guanilo, and like I say, most people, your book spells his name Guanilon, but most books say Guanilo. Fellow monk, what he says is, doesn't this argument really prove too much? See, one way of refuting an argument, and in logic we call this a refutation by logical analogy. I'm never going to ask you that on a test. But it's to develop a parallel piece of reasoning that either proves something absurd or something that's contradictory. And so Guanilo says, wait a second, couldn't I use the same kind of reasoning to show that the most perfect island we can think of or conceive has to actually be out there somewhere to exist in reality, or it wouldn't qualify as the greatest island we could conceive of. And isn't this weird? That somehow from mere thought alone, I should be able to prove that the most perfect island actually exists and is out there somewhere. But Guanilo says, wait a second, isn't this the same kind of reason that you're using to prove God's existence? And so if I can use that reasoning to prove the necessary existence of the most perfect island, doesn't that show us that there's something going wrong here? You know, and that was basically, and Descartes' reply, and I've never been able to feel the force of Descartes' reply. Your book quotes it at length, not Descartes, but Anselm's reply is to somehow say that the case of existence is somehow very different from God because we're talking about with God's concept that somehow is built into the concept. And Descartes tries to do a version of it that takes into account his reply. But at any rate, this is a classical objection. So the most perfect island then can't exist in the mind only, or else it wouldn't qualify as that. So the most perfect island has to exist in reality too, you know. But it seems odd that from mere thought alone, we should be able to prove that it's out there somewhere. And, you know, but if this is the same reasoning involved in the ontological argument, then it's a criticism of it. Again, Anselm's reply is that somehow the case of God is unique, and so the argument works for God but doesn't work for the most perfect island. But it's been hard for me to, you know, if you read it over in your book or if you read it and you think you really feel the force of his objection, you know, I'd be willing to let you explain to me how you think it works, but I've never really been able. Descartes, we're going to see, has an updated version of it that takes into account this objection. So we'll look at that next time. So again, this talk is on your campus the 9th, which is tomorrow, right? No. Okay, right. Tomorrow is the 9th. So what is it? The 10th? I forget whether it's. I thought it was. It's the 9th and the 10th. I have the dates in there, but you know, again, you got to call them ahead of time. So we're going to kind of go on and look at the ontological argument, you know, but also at Aquinas' things. And I'd like to play a part of a bit from the video series because Aquinas talks about some of these other arguments and it kind of updates some of them in interesting ways. So we'll look at that next time after we look at Descartes' version, which won't take us quite as long. Okay, so if you still don't know what's going to, again, a 10-point term, so total of 2 parts, add 10 points, what you got on the test. Okay. Yeah, let me just stop this.